The critical challenge of our times is fragmented and polarized discourse that threaten the better world we have built based on Enlightenment principles. The new Enlightenment Project provides education on the enduring qualities of reason and compassion which define humanism and applies these principles to contemporary challenges. Today, I'm pleased to interview lawyer, political activist, and legal gadfly Carey Linde. Carey has practiced law for more than 50 years, specializing in family law, custody law, shared parenting, parental alienation, divorce, and separation. He's authored the book, Dad, Win Without a Lawyer. I know you will enjoy our conversation with Carey Linde. You have been a lawyer for half a century, and you are currently subject to disciplinary proceedings by the British Columbia Law Society. The Law Society claims you ignored a court gag order in discussing a case involving a transgender youth. You represented her father, and who wanted her to wait until she was 16 before making a decision about transitioning. Why is it important that the public know about the issues surrounding this case?
Well, it's just one example of a phenomenon which is sweeping the Western world, which has multiple explanations, and everybody who has a serious interest in a brain, they can agree on certain things, disagree on other aspects, but the phenomenon of gender dysphoria, which means that an individual, in this case, it's almost exclusively, but not quite, teenage girls, prepubescent girls, are trying to resolve psychological problems they think they have. And the solution that they see among their peers on the social media and being groomed by a funded and growing number of interest groups and lawyers and the cynics who may be right, say pharmaceutical companies, say that they seek a better feeling about themselves if they will accept that they are the wrong gender. And when you start to go down the road that if you are a biologically female, but you believe that your gender should be more masculine, it leads to the huge, I would think it would be a very difficult bridge to cross, that maybe your sex is also wrong, but then it can't be, because you still have your female genitalia, you have XX chromosomes, you could have a baby if you wish, etc., etc. And the problem that I'm trying to deal with isn't that an adult should be able to do what they want with their body and claim to be called whatever they want. The problem arises when it's infants who, defined under various jurisdictions in the provinces or the states or the countries, an infant is an individual 18 or 19 and under, who the law says does not have the capacity to contract, to sue, or be sued. And if a 14-year-old girl is in a car accident, both parents are killed, every jurisdiction has an administrative, legislative function called the public trustee, or somebody who steps in as the guardian. Now, there are two aspects to this. There is an act, which is called the Infants Act in British Columbia, which deals with the guardianship roles, etc. And then we're looking also at a regulation or a mandate of the school system in Canada, in British Columbia, called SOGI, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Now, the Infants Act was changed back in the Harcourt NDP government back in 1993, which says that where a minor goes to a medical physician, and in the sole opinion of that medical physician, regards the minor as competent, is the word, to make decisions about their own medical situation, that doctor can prescribe whatever it is that that infant seeks, and if requested by the infant, not tell the parents. So that's one problem. So that's happening a lot. Parents are unaware that their kids are doing this. Now, that was put in place, if you read the arguments in the legislature, that was put there for one reason and one reason only, so that young girls could get birth control pills. That was it. And there's some commentary that it should not be used for anything else. Maybe abortions. I don't have any evidence on that, but I would suspect that a 16 or a 15-year-old child pregnant who doesn't want their parents to know might go that route. Now, the other villain in the piece is the SOGI, where the public schools are mandated to teach gender issues to kids from, as far as I know, right from the beginning of elementary school. And of course, it's causing chaos across North America, particularly in the United States. But what SOGI says is that and in this case, this child was in grade 7
Yes.
when the school became aware that the child was experiencing gender dysphoria, and could have done what's happening with a lot of kids, help that child rename into a boy's name, not object to wearing boys' clothes.
Well, my understanding, Carey, if I can interject here, because this relates to the case that you're talking about, or that we start out talking about. She was born a girl, and in grade 7, the school decided that she was transgender, and gave her a male name, and the father didn't find out until he read the male name under her picture, and I'm using the word her advisedly, under the child's picture in the school's yearbook.
Right.
And then in grade 8, the school moved the child to a gender clinic to begin hormone treatment without his consent.
Okay, let me just fill the gap. And the gap is that the school also connects the child with a psychologist, and there's really basically only one in the province. And I don't know whether the court orders still prevent me from mentioning names, so I won't. That psychologist does some interviews, connects the child with the pediatric endocrinologist at Children's Hospital in Vancouver. That's correct. Now, in my case, why it's known is because for some reason, the endocrinologist took the unusual step, I think, although I don't know, of advising the parents ahead of time that the doctor, was going to administer puberty blockers and testosterone to this child. That caused a meeting, and that caused the mother consented, and I think there was part of a parental alienation trick happening there, because the child was 50-50 and then moved with the mom. So the father went to court, and the other side went to court, and it led into it's been going on for 2 years. It still isn't over, in the sense that, and it started, the first judgment came down in late February 2019, went on and on. It went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal of British Columbia fixed some of the most egregious errors, but left it to the point where the child could determine their own medicalization. Then the father went and, on purpose, in an act of classic civil disobedience, went out and breached the court order by talking publicly about the various aspects of the case that there were court orders saying he couldn't do. Now, I made some mistakes in my very first interviews and misgendered the child and said a few things that were technically against the court orders and the Law Society, which is becoming very overtaken by the virus of critical social justice, becoming very woke. The Law Society determined that I was to be treated in the same manner as lawyers who steal trust funds or bribe witnesses or do moralistically evil things. And they held that I had conducted myself in a bad manner, and it's called conduct unbecoming. They do say, however, in the judgment that while my client willfully breached court orders, I never did. So at least they're giving me the credit of saying that whatever breaches were made by me were not intentional or were by error. So the sentencing, the hearing was in May of 2022. In April of this year, they came down after 10 months with their decision, and the sentence phase is probably going to be in late September.
Okay.
So I expect that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Carey, I have misgendered this child by calling the child by the female pronoun. Could I be in trouble for that?
Well, the Law Society, no. But the Law Society, I did an interview. It's an interesting question because what we're doing right now is in a sort of a gray area. As time goes by, it moves more and more towards the white because it's been years now. But I was interviewed. I got a call from a young woman in California a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, in the middle of all of this, and said she wanted to do an interview. And so I said, under two conditions. Well, first of all, I looked at her website, and it looked pretty good because I got called very early on. I found myself being interviewed by a couple of real rednecks in Alberta who were just, I regret going on. So I pay more attention. She looked like she had a really good website. So I said, under two conditions. One is you give me a copy of the complete interview, and you don't mention my client's name. And she said, I've got the emails. I promised not to mention your client's name. So I did an interview. And literally almost the same day, I was talking to the Law Society, who was on my case. I had a lawyer there investigating me for other things. And he mentioned that he'd just been advised by one of the trans ideologue lawyers who out there grooming and supporting these kids, that I'd done an interview. There's an interview out there from someone in California who mentions my client's name. And I said, oh, well, and at the end of it all, one of the charges against me in my citations was, oddly, that I should not have given the interview because I should have realized that there was no way I could guarantee she wouldn't mention the name. And my response to that was, fly a kite, Jack. It's not my job. It's not my job to do that. And they dismissed that allegation. So when you ask me, can you be doing this? I'm supposed to say you shouldn't, because in British Columbia, but you are outside the jurisdiction.
Okay, so maybe I'm safe there. I think what you're being nailed for, in part anyway, is being naive about the integrity of journalists. But this is not the first time you've been in trouble with the BC Law Society. In 1971, before you were called to the bar, you were cited for stating, and I'm going to use the exact quote that I got off the internet, "The legal profession is the only one that knows its ass from a hole in the ground because it spends all the time looking back at it." Do you remember making that statement, and what did you mean by it?
Well, I'll get to that. The process when you get out of law school is you apply to article. Mm-hmm. And my application to article was refused and kicked up. I had a 2-day hearing before all the benchers, unheard of for articles, and there's no appeal from it. After 2 days, I got in. I do remember that comment. It was made at the law school in Ontario, where Craig Patterson, very progressive guy who just died recently, was the president, and it was a conference of lawyers, judges, and students. I was at the time the president of the law students at UBC, And I remember doing two things. I'd just come back from I think it was, I'd attended the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. It was
The
just
famous
after
one.
that. Yeah, I was there for that, Cecil B. DeMille extravaganza. But I remember at one point asking everybody in the audience to hold hands with the person next to them. That was a very radical and embarrassing move for everybody. And in my speech, I made that comment that because the law is based almost entirely, 99.999% on precedent. What's been done in the past? You want to know what's going to happen in a case? What have they done in the past? It's extremely difficult to move in any kind of evolutionary way forward with the law. And that's what I was talking about.
Okay. So you've been an activist then. Actually, I'm going to say you've been an activist and socialist most of your life. Why? What's attracted you to the left? Or what did attract you to the left back then?
I was thinking about that, funnily, as I was sitting in the dentist chair this morning, that my parents, first of all, both sides of my family, and on my mother's side, there's activists which go way back to Minnesota, which was a hotbed in the late 1800s and early part of the 20th century of progressives. And they were atheists, among other things, both sides, artists. I had lawyers on my mother's side. I had Harvard grads on my father. I have an intellectual background with my family, my grandfather, and my uncles. And what I wasn't trained. I don't remember being educated or taught anything. But I think the significant thing was I wasn't taught anything. They didn't take it. They didn't take time. That's the wrong way to put it. They did not try to inculcate in me any belief. And so I didn't have to fight or overcome the religion or any particular. They were Democrats, progressive Democrats. I remember my father, going out and working for Adlai Stevenson in his 2 elections to defeat Eisenhower and those kinds of things. And I was brought up in New England, and Vermont is a very progressive area. So I had that background, but I think more importantly, I didn't see anything as being taboo. And then if you look at the world from a neutral position, I think you can't help but be a socialist.
Okay. So you were born and raised in the United States, in Vermont. Your parents have long roots there. Why did you choose to come to BC, to Vancouver?
Well, throughout my entire childhood, up until university, I was a bit of a loner. My parents got divorced when I was 8. I moved around a lot. I had some friends, but never close because I kept moving. So I was pretty much on my own a lot. And I didn't get along with my sister. I mean, I can psychoanalyze myself till the cows come home. But the result was that as a boy, I spent a lot of my time out in the woods and with animals and fish and bird and trapping and taxidermy, all that kinds of stuff. So I was really into wildlife. And in the 1950s, when I was going to school, I went to school in New Hampshire. I subscribed to the 3 hunting magazines: Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, and I forget what the third one was. And all of the big game in the hunting, the really big game was Alaska. But you got to remember, back in the 1950s, Alaska was like on the far side of the moon for somebody in New England. Manitoba was the place to fish in North America, and British Columbia, short of Alaska, was the place to hunt and get animals. And I wanted to be a field biologist or something like that. So I remember applying when I was in grade 10 or 11 to the University of British Columbia, Canada. And it worked. So here I am. And then, of course,
Okay.
my class roots, then I discovered that there was philosophy, psychology, history, religion, all those kinds of things. And in my second year, I just lost it. I didn't know what to do. And I took 2 years off. And then in my first year off, I ran into Tim Leary and Dick Alpert, who had just been fired as Harvard profs for their use of psilocybin and LSD and in legitimate experiments. But the psychedelics became democratized and got out into the grad students were having parties and doing other things. And that led to some publicity, which led to those two Harvard tenured professors getting fired. And my interest in that got me, and I did a year in music school at the Berklee School of Music, the Boston Conservatory. My father was being very liberal, just sort of kept trying to help. And then I got back into UBC, and my class roots got a hold of me, and I went into law school.
And so eventually you graduated, and they actually let you article, and you became a lawyer. You became the first lawyer to practice in Haida Gwaii. Why did you choose a remote Aboriginal location instead of an urban area like Kamloops?
Well, it's a very simple answer. I can't say I despised lawyer, but I had zero respect for lawyers who I viewed as the lapdogs from the feudal system into the crown and representing the landed interests, to put it in classic Marxist terms. And so I wanted to practice where there were no lawyers. And I looked around the province. Hazelton area in British Columbia had no lawyers. There were no lawyers up in the Doukhobor area, in the Kootenays outside of Nelson. And so I went to look at the Queen Charlotte Islands as they then were, Haida Gwaii, and there'd been no lawyers there. And the chief, the hereditary band chief, I think he was also the hereditary chief of the Skidegate Haida, also the band chief, said, well, come and apply to live with us. Well, a white liberal Eastern kid couldn't pass that up. And then I became the first lawyer ever to practice on an Indian reserve in Canada. So I raised my family there until for 14 years, and my marriage fell apart, and I moved back to Vancouver, and I've been here ever since.
Okay, what did you learn from your? I'm going to use the name that was used back then. What did you learn from your experience in the Queen Charlottes?
Well, I learned how to live in an area where you depend upon yourself. It wasn't actually, it's not the frontier, but it sure was for me. You cannot rely upon tradespeople because there really aren't any. So anything goes wrong, you've got two choices. You fix it, or you get the Sears catalog out, you order something out of Vancouver, and you wait 2 weeks for it to get delivered. It was that basic. So I had I had about an acre or two that the Skidegate Haida permitted Indian Affairs to survey off. I had a 99-year lease, which I still have, for $1 a year. And there I lived, and I came there with 2 kids, and I had a third. And I learned a lot of things. I learned how to live in a community. I have to tell you that the Skidegate Haida were at the time all across the country, they were the single per capita highest income earning First Nations people in the country, because they fished and they logged. And so they were more, to the extent that capitalism and that kind of success could be identified with being a European mentality, they were more of that. Cape Mudge was similar, but in any event, so I never forget, at one point after we'd been there for several years, talking to one of my kids, well, your friends, the Indians. And they said, what Indians? I said, oh, because the school bus stopped at our place north of the village first thing in the morning. So my kids got on the school bus. It then went into Skidegate, because I was about a half a mile north of Skidegate on the beach. And they go into Skidegate and pick up the Haidas and take them into Queen Charlotte City to the school. And they said they never realized that those kids were Indians. They knew who Indians were in the movies and stuff. So it was kind of fun. But I also learned some other things. I learned about, the intermixing of kids with grandparents and not parents. When I got there, I discovered that the NDP had just come in for the first time, the Dave Barrett government in Victoria. One of the things they set out to do, Norm Levy, who was the very progressive minister of Ministry of Kids and Health and stuff, he put a social worker permanently up in Masset, And one of the things they set out to do was to regularize all of the Indian adoptions. They were all over the place. The local people were adopting. If some 14-year-old gets pregnant, an aunt adopts the kid. Everybody knew that. And I remember talking to kids, well, how's your mom doing? Who? And I thought, and they said, no, that's not my mother. That's my aunt. Oh, well, who's your mother? And they'd mention somebody else. And I'd say, oh, how'd that happen? And it was just all, it just worked. And the other thing is that the matriarchy system was to some extent still alive, that the important person in your family was your father's mother. Your father's sister. And chieftainships went cross that way. And it was a way to prevent consanguinity, because you were either an eagle or a raven. That was sort of not practiced, but people were aware that they might breach it. There was a little bit left of the old ways, but the new ways were taking over. And I remain a complete cynic, as you know from my questioning of you on occasion, that the new discovery by indigenous people of their history is to some extent a complete, I won't say fabrication because it was real, but the Renaissance, which you can see around the place, is somewhat false in the sense that it's kind of like when I was in my 20s, in the 60s, the youth rediscovered the past. They rediscovered Buddhism. They rediscovered stuff. And we had a fascination with the Indians of North America, those that had survived, because they were the people of the land. They liked circles. And the whole
is this the noble savage thing?
Well, there was a touch of that, yeah. And
or more romanticism for
yeah,
Aboriginal
right.
people. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, then, and I may be completely wrong, and I don't mean to besmirch anybody, but some of the Indian people sort of caught on to that and played that game, and you had people pushing the art. Now, having said that, I was very fortunate to be a counsel and a friend with George Manuel back in the 70s, and traveled to Geneva on conferences. And I met with the AIM people, Russell Means, and the people from the United States. I was right in there when the serious political Indian movement began. Leonard Peltier, he was busted in Canada and shipped back. So on the one hand, I was watching what I call the taking advantage of people. And on the other hand, I was right there when the hardcore were trying to do their thing, and the combination of the two seems to have won over. And that's great. Yeah.
Now you mentioned, Haida, family relationships and the intricacies, and it's a different family structure. And then did that influence you later, because you pioneered the concept of shared parenting as applied to law? Is there a relationship here? And in any case, why is shared parenting important?
Well, I never thought of that, actually, as upfront as that is. The agency, the connection between my experiences, well, I guess I didn't have as close a relationship with my father. My parents got divorced. And I saw the role of fathers and kids. I started doing family law. And I saw, then I got involved with Robert Bly and different people in the United States who were part of the Roots movement. Now, there's two aspects. I'll come back to what you said, but I noticed very early on that there was two camps. There were the Roots people, who were men trying to get back to their warrior status, quote unquote, and going into the woods and meeting with men and men's groups and all of this. That was the Roots movement. Then at the same time, after that, developed the fathers' rights movement. So there's the rights movement, and the roots movement. And I found that, and I got really involved in the roots movement. I found that people who were in the roots movement had a great deal of empathy and completely understood the rights, fathers' rights movement. But the people in the fathers' rights movement remain sort of cynical and would say things like, yeah, you're going to go in the woods and take a stick and hit an oak tree. You can do that this weekend? You know, and so just as an additional comment, I find that people from the city have a hard time in the country at night. They won't walk around in the dark. People in the country have a better time in the city. However, I think people in the country can be just as uptight, nervous, and screwed up in their mentality and anxious as anybody in the city, and vice versa. You can live a very remote life in the city. It's all how you treat yourself in your head. Now, I've forgotten where we were, or the connection. So when I first started doing family law, I sat around in the courts just to watch and see what was going on, because I'd never done it. I'd always done, trial work for personal injury and stuff. And I kept hearing this phrase, primary parent. A lawyer would stand up and say, well, my mother client is the primary parent. Give me the kid. And it seemed to work. And there was I'd come from from litigation where you have to prove your evidence. If you make a point, you got to prove it. If you claim something, prove it. And I never heard anybody have to prove, where does this primary parent come from? So I figured, well, it must be in some famous case. Nowhere. Did not exist. It was completely a cultural concept, a biased cultural concept. And then I ran into the works of Warren Farrell in the United States, and we became friends, and we worked sort of side by side without knowing each other. And I started to realize that there were phenomenal benefits that kids got from their fathers. And that research was either not known in North America, most of it comes out of Scandinavia, or it was suppressed. And then when I realized that there was a very famous study out of Scandinavia, which said that if you take the children from various backgrounds, you look at them when they're adults and you measure them on as many criteria as possible, the very best kids are those from father-only families. Now let's look at that. The options were father-mother family, mother family, father-only family. So the result was the kids who have most empathy get along from the. Now, okay, but you got to think of something really significant. And that is, back then, we're talking 30 years ago, the fathers who had the ability and the want to have their children were a grade above most others. And a lot of mothers who had kids were impoverished, couldn't get along. So you got to look at where these come from. But the fact nonetheless remained. And of course, the courts hate statistics. They want to look at every case on its own merits, which has its ups and its downs. But if you want to tell a judge that if you're looking statistically, the odds are that the kids will do better with their dad than with their mom. But you can't say that because
in fact, I don't think, Carey, that you actually just said that either, because you just said that the fathers who had custody were the top ability fathers who fought for that custody, or alternatively was given the custody by the system or the mother who recognized their limitations. But where kids say both mothers and fathers were deficient, it was the norm back 30 years ago to place the child with the mother. So therefore, you had it was not a representative sample.
No, and the fathers also probably had more funds to hire lawyers.
Yeah.
So that kind of started to make me think, and I found that, I mean, that was, I'd like to say, but I can't, that might have been the beginning of my sense that woke was on the horizon. I'm not sure it was. There was a lot, the feminist movement was on a rage. I don't know whether we're in stage 2 or 3 of feminism, but feminists were coming out and beginning, particularly if you read the odd book that was coming out, were really starting to slam the males and take issue with the males. Now that was percolating, and it's now recognized because there's all these different people and these authors, and it's a topic that pretty well anybody can get involved with. But back then, I think I just had a reaction against that, and there was this arrogance, this absolute arrogance by lawyers for mothers that just drove me nuts. Another fact. Okay, here, this may be. I'm psychoanalyzing myself as I sit here. The mother of my children died when they were 14, 12, and 8. So I remember standing in court, and hearing lawyers say what fathers are incapable of. I never thought about that, and that was very personal to me. And I think that was that. Yeah, that was a pretty good motivation.
So what you're describing is in the court system of the day, it was assumed that mothers were the primary parent, and you were fighting for the underdog.
Yeah, there were 2 theories. One was the age. There's a famous Supreme Court of Canada case where that woman with the long French name, the judge, basically says that all things being equal, the father should be a visitor in the family of the child, and we shouldn't pay too much attention to what he wants. That was in the 80s. It's absolutely shocking how crazy the whole thing was.
Now let's go back to the Law Society, because I want to dwell on that a little bit more. You've had several dust-ups with them. And in 2021, you sent out a notice to the BC lawyers, and the headline for the notice was, "Don't miss the gunfight at the LSBC Corral." You were inviting lawyers to support a motion, as I recall, that the Law Society should endorse rational and unfettered discourse. And the motion was defeated, although closely. Without support, and but the staff. Well, here's what I want to get to. The staff lawyer for the Law Society sent you a subsequent letter stating that your headline could, and I'm going to quote from her document, from her letter, that your statement could be seen as inciting violence and mocking the AGM, the legal profession, or the administration of justice. It would likely be considered inappropriate and contrary to maintaining the integrity of the profession. Why, Carey, is the Law Society so opposed to freedom of speech that they threaten individual lawyers in this way?
They think that the ministry of children and the lawyers are children, and they have to be coddled. It's unbelievable. Here's what happened. There's a committee of the Canadian Bar Association, British Columbia branch, also called SOJIC, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. It's a half dozen or a dozen lawyers. The odd one, a couple of them, I think. I was about to say the odd one being transgender, but I'd get tackled because they're not odd, Anyway, and they had a decision. They had an idea. They were going to convince the Chief Justice to mandate that when lawyers introduce themselves and their clients and their witnesses in a court, that they state their gender identification. And the background to all of this is that the whole gender thing is that people who believe that they are not binary or are the other gender use the word preferred. So if you feel compelled, you stand up and you say, my preferred gender is whatever. Okay. Now, you can be a male and believe that you have your gender is female, and you can say, I would prefer you call me by my woman's name and that my pronouns are she and her. That's a preference. I have no problem with, but you don't say I am a woman. I don't go for that, but that's the current debate. So the Chief Justice, who got totally duped, Chief Justice Hinkson, got conned big time by this committee because he was convinced, and he tried to be, what's the word? Tried to be shown to be nice with all of them. He put out a directive in December of 2021, I forget, that said from now on, lawyers will advise the court of their correct pronoun. Completely screwed it up. That's the whole argument, the difference between preferred and correct. Because I can go up and say to a judge as a male and say, my preferred pronouns are she and her. But my correct pronouns, as I say, are as you would find from my XY chromosomes. So the judge, Hinkson, made this enormous mistake. The response was, nobody noticed that. So still don't. But the response was immediate. A lot of judges got really upset. And Shadin Farside wrote a very intellectual, legalistic article for the local lawyers magazine called The Advocate. And you cannot read that article and come away with any idea of what Shadin thinks about transgender people at all. It makes no comment on the issue. What it does say is that it infringes judges' rights to govern the process of their own court. That's true. Who can complain about that? And it's a violation of people's freedoms, and maybe someone doesn't want to be outed. And it's a speech issue. Now, she was within so she goes to the editor of The Advocate, who says, this is a really good article. It's bang on. I will publish, this was in January. I'll publish it in the March issue, but I'm going to give the subject committee people an opportunity to respond. Well, as soon as they heard about it, I don't think they even read it. As soon as they heard about it, they threatened to take the editor to the Human Rights Tribunal because he was being transphobic. The article was hateful, and he backed out. Then the Canadian Lawyer magazine out of Toronto took a slightly shortened version, same thing, and put it up on their website. They then received an email with 60 lawyers threatening them and saying, if you don't take that down and apologize, none of us are going to contribute to your magazine ever again. So he chickened out. So then there was in October of that year, there was an annual general meeting of the Law Society. In the meantime, there were 3 benchers, 2 of which benchers on the board of governors of the lawyers, who went after Shadin, who is a Iranian woman of color, young woman. He went after her in the most vulgar, defamatory way anybody could imagine. They just took her to pieces. As benchers, nobody ever called them on the carpet for conduct unbecoming. I wrote a letter and went after them seriously. One of the benchers ended up being he was the vice chair, co-chair of the discipline committee, who issued citations against me. He didn't have the forethought to recuse himself because I had attacked him personally. And that's an issue in my citation.
Yeah, so there's a conflict of interest there.
Absolutely. But they don't see it. Not only that, the lawyer who represented the Law Society prosecuting me on those 3 days of my hearing, it's technically a hearing, I call it a trial. She's not a prosecutor, but she is. She appeared on behalf of a community, that's the name of this organization, a queer gay organization with all of the alphabet letters in it, to intervene in the Court of Appeal when CD, my father client of the trans youth, was appealing the bullshit orders from below. She represented this organization to become interveners, which would have given them some status to speak at the appeal. It was turned down. So there she is in court arguing that my client's daughter should be permitted to do all this stuff. She was a groomer for the idea that these kids should be groomed to do these things. And then she appears to prosecute me, and nobody thinks a word of it. Now, I'm going to find out whether she ever told the Law Society about that. I'm giving her the credit of the doubt and saying she did not, because I'd like to think the Law Society would say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. You can't do that. On the other hand, if she did, wouldn't surprise me at all if the Law Society went for this. Because then literally 4 days before my hearings began, one bencher, without hearing any argument, decided to close the hearing to the public when the Law Society had just come out with a very expensive report which recommended more openness, more clarity, get the public involved, had a whole section on shutting things down. But they, on a bunch of bogus arguments, all the things they wanted to protect were already in the court orders of the Supreme Court, which can govern anybody in the province, whereas directions made by the Law Society only govern lawyers, nobody else. If the Law Society says you, Lloyd, can't say something and you do it, they've got no jurisdiction. They can't do squat to you. Whether the Supreme Court could, and that's a different matter, because you follow what I'm saying. Anyway, so one of the things I'm going to do before I want to have a hearing, again, before my penalty phase, to seek to open it back up. Because all of the fears they had, nothing untoward happened in the 3 days. So they can't justify it. So I forget again, mad cow, how we got it. That's sort of where I'm at.
Well, yeah, it looks to me like you brought up Shadden Farsa. I happen to have interviewed her earlier in this series.
Yes.
And not satisfied with censoring her articles, some members of the Law Society questioned whether she should be a lawyer, and as you said, they were quite vicious. And they got after you, and it sounds like it's a war. It's a no holds bar. What happened to the rule of law precedents? Lawyers have a reputation for being independent thinkers. What is them from rising up and saying enough of this bullshit?
Okay, there's two things. I want to go back to what happened at the annual general meeting and the gunfight at the LSB corral. The other thing is, let's go. I was just looking at an app that I had a young lady come in and ask me to help her fill out an application for the law school at UBC. In one of the paragraphs, she asked, she's going to make an essay question about how have you experienced identity oppression in your life? Can you believe it? So lawyers are being, the ones that can get into law school are already weeded out as having any independent thought. But let's go back to the AGM. So Jim Heller, who you know, and Shadden put a motion to the annual general meeting of the Law Society, which said in support of public debate. You shouldn't be able to shut down the Advocate or the Canadian Lawyer magazine, because these benchers were saying there are some things on which there's no two sides. Well, nonsense. If lawyers are told that they can't argue anything that they want or a client wants them to do, what's happening? So now, the Law Society sends out to every single lawyer by email these things. And they have a site where you can get some arguments, but nobody can get their hands on that. The Criminal Law Association sent something out to all of their people urging defeat of the motion. The Vancouver Bar Association, which has thousands of members and a private list of emails, they sent out an email saying defeat it. The BC branch of the Canadian Bar Association, which has probably 80% of the lawyers in the province, sent out an email on behalf of the membership saying defeat it. And Shadden and Jim and I in the proposals of this thing couldn't get our hands on anybody's emails. So
email lists.
Email list. So I created a website to try to stimulate activity. And I had a poster of that great Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster standing, the gunfight at the OK Corral. And it was all yellow, and they were standing there with a rifle, and they had the headlines and the movie shit. And I put that very small picture on this thing. And I said, then I did get my hands on 5,000 lawyers' email addresses. Of the 15,000, somebody went and picked out 5. So I headed the email Law Society Blues. Now, this is just marketing technique. You want to get someone's attention. What is this? Because we wanted people to say, look, this is coming up. Go to this website. I had a website called Here Two Sides. Here, number 2 sides. And in there, I had all the issues. I had Shadden's article. I had some articles about her. I had the issues. So I sent that out to 5,000 people. I got one email back and said, take me off your list. That's it. I expected a bit more of a backlash, maybe from the Law Society. Nothing. Then I get a letter from the Law Society. Now, this was on Zoom. Lawyers were in their homes, in their offices at home, or maybe even in their bedrooms under the cover, scared about the gunfight at the law. So this female member complains that she felt threatened by the email, and she was fearful of violence. From whom and where? Watching her, as I'm looking at you, fearful of violence on a Zoom. The whole thing was absolutely absurd. And I wrote back, you guys are nuts. The coddling of these people. How much are you going to protect? At what point does a lawyer have to go to a psychologist rather than the Law Society? And why bother me with this nonsense? And, nothing ever came of it. But that's what they pick up. They've sent me after that. I won't go into it all. There's 3 or 4 other things, which are just de minimis, just the stupidest stuff.
Well, trans activists.
I have an opinion, as you can see. I have an opinion on some of these things.
And we've been talking about trans activism, but what we're facing is much more, because the actual trans people are fewer. The actual transsexual people are fewer than 1% of the population. I understand. Yeah. Now, cancel culture is part of this movement, and it's bigger than the trans movement. You mentioned safetyism. We have to make things safe for me, because there's always an emphasis on a personal subjectivity. So there's an emphasis on safetyism, and there's transsectionality is involved. That's you mentioned feminism, and this is what academic feminism has morphed into. There's something called social justice, but it lacks consistent principles of justice, such as fair play, which we've talked about. It's sometimes called critical thinking, but it suspends critical thinking in favor of, a preset dogma. It's sometimes called progressive, but it attacks the progress that we've made, we've achieved since the Enlightenment. It's sometimes called the left. In fact, it's often called the left, but that's not the left you're familiar with, because this left is in a tight alliance with government and business, and they disparage the working class. They're the establishment. They're the people that have the power and that you're fighting against. They are sometimes called the woke because they've, I don't know, misappropriated the U.S. black slang from the early part of the 20th century, but I've read where they perhaps are more closely resembled the 18th and 19th century woke, the people of the Great Awakenings of fundamentalist Christianity, because they have a rigid Puritanism about them, and being from Vermont, you would know about that. Well,
in simple terms, in simple terms, very simple terms, it's feelings over facts. They won't debate anything. I've experienced it. You cannot get one of these ideologues to debate.
Yeah.
They take a motif and they fly with it. Let me give you some examples. This is going to annoy some people. I tried with some other people on this commission to look into the missing and murdered women and girls. There was a contingent of men and women, native and non-native, who tried to get the Trudeau government to include missing men and boys. If you go on the Statistics Canada, you can see that 3.5, this was a couple of years ago, 3.5 times as many men and boys are murdered and go missing as women and girls. Fact. On the trans murder, everywhere you look, there are people saying that trans women, men who believe that they are women, getting murdered. You can also go on American statistics, and you can look at the number of women murdered, and you look at the populations, and you look at the number of trans, and the percentage is that notional trans women are getting murdered less than the national rate. Now, in Canada, there are two examples that I've researched. One was, there's an award which is given out in British Columbia in the name of a Filipino woman who held herself out as a trans man who was murdered. And I was looking at it, and I happened to notice the name of the man who defended the accused murderer, a friend of mine. So I phoned him up. Remember that case 15 years ago? Oh, yeah. Now, was it ever suggested that there was anything to do with transgenderism underlying this case? No, had nothing to do with that. Okay, but that's being held out as the example. The other one is, and you may recall this, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a trans woman in Toronto who was a renowned activist and with some credibility of trying to help the community there. And she was murdered, and the mayor of Toronto, this was just before Christmas, about 4 years ago, the mayor of Toronto came out condemning the murder of trans people, et cetera, et cetera. However, it turns out that the man who killed her, it was a fight over drugs. He had some history of thinking that he was trans. It had nothing to do with this victim being trans. And yet these two examples are held high. So you can't believe anything you hear. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact, and I don't want to be seen as taking away from the fact, that the trans community of either gender is stigmatized by bigoted and biased racists, homophobes, and all of that. I mean, it's real. And I've always said I have no problem with any adult wanting to do what they wish, but as long as they understand that if you want to, I mean, there's two things which are accepted by both sides, more or less. One is that the suicide rate among these people who want to transition is really high. And the suicide rate among those who do transition remains pretty much the same. So the transitioning and the hormones and all that is not doing the trick. Other things probably are. That's one thing. The other thing, which seems to be accepted by almost everybody, and this is a statistic, if you leave a 13 or a 14 or a 15-year-old minor alone, don't administer puberty blockers, when they get through puberty, it's at 80 to 90% percentage. Forget about it. They get through it.
They develop their identity.
They go back to their gender, what they were born, and they're fine with it. Now, there's another famous case of mine here, which I'm restricted to say too much about, and that was where a mother came to me and said that her 17-year-old child, cautious, because Law Society is going to slap me, her 17-year-old child, estranged, she and my client and her ex-husband were apart. This 17-year-old was living in a provincially provided social youth place, had just advised her that the child was on testosterone for the last 6 months. And in a week or 10 days hence was going to have this child is 17, a double mastectomy. So my client went to work through various means to find out who these doctors were. We found the GP, who was a man going publicly as a doctor as a female. So a transgendered woman was the doctor prescribing the testosterone. The surgeon, we discovered, I'm free to say his name, but I don't see a purpose. So I'm not going to do that. So what we did was, out of the CD case, we've talked about the 14-year-old, the Court of Appeal came down and set out rules as to how you proceed and how you proceed in court on these questions. It's got to be a family claim. But we decided not to do that. So I commenced on her behalf a civil claim in the civil registry where the media has access, because the media does not have access to the family registry. Can't find out what's going on there. And I filed a claim in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I was in front of a judge, ex parte, which means I didn't serve the surgeon, and I was granted a 1-month injunction against the operation. So I had a court order forbidding this doctor to rip out my client's child's breasts. The media, of course, my client promoted that, and the media was all over it. The same lawyers who found CD's child, they go out and what they do is it's a clique. And they come from Denton's law firm, and there's a big book by Denton's on how to do this. They're the biggest law firm in the country, out of Australia. They love the trans clients. They went on Facebook and said, way back to my client, my first client's child, and to this child, we are here, come to us, we will represent you for nothing. So they got a hold of this case, and they got me back into court exactly a month later. And the judge was, the new judge, they showed that I hadn't properly done the right stuff. I hadn't served the father. My injunction was improperly obtained, blah, 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 blah. And it was in the wrong courts. It should have been in the family registry. Shame on you, Mr. Linde, blah, 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 blah. And the whole thing was thrown out. So the transgender ideologues, a victory. They got my scalp, right? Well, little do they know that today, 2 or 3 years later, this child has detransitioned, is wearing a dress, and has a boyfriend. So from my client's point of view and my point of view, a great success. Even though if you go to the trans ideologues, it's a wampum belt. They kicked my butt, they think.
But you got the results in the end that the mother wanted.
This child still has her breasts.
Uh, how does this transgender activism fit into the general phenomenon of wokism that includes things like critical race theory and whatnot?
You know, I try to read up on everything. I've got every book that's come out on the subject. Start out as 1, 2, and I won't show you, but there's, I got about 30 of them here. That's a good question. It's a combination of what I say is modern late stage capitalism, in which young people are missing some kind of anchor for their identity. And among girls, for some reason, it's very interesting. 5 to 10 years ago, in England, Tavistock, which has now been shut down, kept statistics. And the ratio of boys wanting to be girls as against girls wanting to be boys was more boys than girls. And a couple of years ago, maybe a year or two ago, the statistic was it had reversed to a factor of 4,000. We're talking about 1,000 and many hundred kids, but the ratio switched so radically that it's really a rapid onset gender dysphoria, which has to be understood. There are cases where a child at the age of 2 wants to wear a boy wants to wear mommy's clothes and claims to be a girl. Those things go on for years and years, and by the time they're 10 or 12, they persist in that, and the doctors say this child has a gender dysphoria that's been lasting for years. That's one category, and they've always been around, but they're few. Then there's the rapid onset, which was in both cases of my cases, both cases. The third, which we didn't take to court, was that there was no sign of this up until 11 or 12 years old. And all of a sudden, bang, it comes on, rapid onset. That's the vast majority. And there are different reasons why that's happening. If you look on various of the social websites, some of the dating sites, interestingly enough, when you go into certain areas, you find these teenage girls chit-chatting in mass numbers. And you combine that with the fact that a lot of girls hear that it's not safe to be a girl. You can get beaten up or raped, or it's better to be a boy, or there's all kinds of things that are working. But I think fundamentally underneath it's in the family. They don't have something which makes them deal with their. When's the last time you ever heard anybody referred to as a tomboy? It doesn't exist. Tomboys, if left alone, grow up to be marvelous women. Now, all these identity groups grab them. The transgender and the SOGI in the schools and this crazy psychologist who sees a tomboy and says, "Oh, come with me. You're actually a boy. We're going to give you some gender changing."
I'd like to read you a transcript that fits in exactly with what I think you're saying right now. It's a transcript of a kindergarten class in Montreal. It was in French, but it's been translated by one of our board members, Michel Verard. And here and here's the transcript. On a March day, in a Montreal daycare center, a dozen or so 5-year-olds, mostly girls, welcome a special guest. The speaker, a sexologist from an organization specializing in the field, has come to talk to them about gender. "How do you know you're a boy or a girl?" she asks. "Girls are girls and boys are boys because of ourselves," replies the child, displaying beautiful self-assurance. "It's true," replies the speaker, "that there's a so-called biological or genetic part that makes you a boy or a girl. After that, how do you personally know whether you're a boy or a girl? A child tries to enlighten her. At delivery, she says, the doctors know whether it's a boy or a girl. For a boy, they put him in a towel of or blanket in blue, and for a girl, it's pink. A discussion of color preferences then arises, and some girls confess to preferring the color blue. Good, but the speaker comes back with to the point. The question I had was, how do you know how you feel you're a boy or a girl? Are we able to answer that? Because we don't have penises, proposes one little girl. But we're not going to show everyone our vulva. The speaker doesn't give up. It's true that there are differences, as we said earlier, that are biological. But how do you know if I say to you, are you a boy or a girl? And do you really believe strongly? How do you know? I don't have a penis, insists the young girl, speaking louder to finally be heard. To another child who asserts that she's a girl, the practitioner asks, are you convinced? The answer is, when you look, you can see your vulva or your penis. It's not complicated, though, but it's getting tiresome. 5 minutes have gone by already. Can we go now? Because we're bored, says a girl. Speaker, are you bored with the subject? Yes. You didn't answer my question, though. I hate it, replies a girl, while cries of penis, penis, or is it tennis, are heard. Finally, these girls, by the way, are only 5 years old, and they're not freaks. Eventually, they come to understand what the adult wants to hear. One child replies, that you feel it inside you. Bingo, comes the reply. That's a really nice answer, says the caregiver. May you feel it inside you. Is it any wonder that children are getting confused as to what sex they are?
You know, that one would like to think that's an isolated incident, but it's not. It's ubiquitous among North Americans, apparently the English. You know, one of the comments I'd like to make, an interjection, I don't know where you might put this, is that in terms of how we get out of this, these doctors, and particularly the parents, the mothers, who allow their children, particularly their daughters, to go through hormonal transition, mastectomies, will never, ever, ever be open to understanding or admitting to their errors, because when it becomes apparent that it hasn't worked, as is the case in most of them, not all of them, some of them, there's some great successes, and, you know, good for them as adults. But these parents will never admit to themselves what they've done to their own children. And, you know, these doctors must have the same sense. And I don't have any, you know, I have sympathy with them as human beings, that they've been caught up in a virus, a mind virus, as you, Lloyd, have so superbly articulated in writing. But they'll never come around. Nobody will ever come around. And what you get is the conservative right using the word woke all the time with no understanding of what it's about. You know, let's take critical race theory. The idea that there should be education about race in schools caused an uproar among the conservative right. And the current governor of, is it Georgia? Yeah, who ran on that single subject. We got to get critical race theory out of the schools. He was supported not by people who are anti-woke, who intellectually understand the games that are being played. He was supported by racist bigots. So DeSantis and all these people and these politicians who throw the word woke around are appealing to bigots and white supremacists who have no idea of postmodernism and the Foucaultian use of words and the changing around and the refusal and the attempts to defeat the Enlightenment and science and fact. And what's happening in the universities, in the sciences of all places, is the most scary. The most recent thing I heard was a university somewhere in the California system is dropping a advanced trigonometry or some advanced math course because the African American students are having a hard time with it. So rather than continue, we'll get rid of it. And that's happening all over the place. Professors are refusing to go along with things and they get canceled.
Is there another word besides wokeism that you'd use to describe or to label this phenomenon?
Yeah, identitarianism.
Identitarianism.
The idea, it's a simple idea, is that you have to find your identity group, and your interests are part of the identity group. Now, you, sir, as Métis, have your own identity group. I, on the other hand, have no identity group. I'm white, heterosexual, male. I'm us people who are in that category, patriarchal, don't have any group that's funded by the government that we can join. Everybody else does. So you get into a group. Then, like, where you see it in its classical sense is Black Republicans in the United States are cast out, criticized by other Blacks as being, Uncle Toms. How can you be Black and be a Republican? So you're supposed to go forward, advancing the positions and the ideology of your collective group, whatever that is. And that's wokeism at its center core.
Okay, so I'll call them the far right, dating back to the Nazis. They're identitarian as well, aren't they?
That's interesting, because there's some commentary now on how the Nazis, how Hitler and National Socialism started out under the umbrella of socialist thought and policy, which it may have been, and maybe even Mussolini, I don't know. But then their socialism became an identity group that excluded, well, obviously the Jews and other people. So it turned fascist. But the thing that I have a lot of video from just before the pandemic, there was a lot of demonstrations. Pandemic shut it down, particularly around Megan Murphy, who was a radical feminist, a TERF, who said that, transgender is okay, but you must preserve women in sports, keep trans women in male prisons, and keep them out of women's locker rooms. That was a narrow, and I support that. And we had she'd speak, and the crowds would come out with bullhorns, and they wouldn't let you speak. And who were the Nazis? They were accusing everybody as Nazi. And I tried very hard, Antifa, tried very hard to get anybody who would talk. They can't, they won't, they can't talk. I did run into one woman who was a little bit mentally ill. It was outside of one of Megan Murphy's talks, and she was yelling at me that I didn't understand. And I said, well, just a minute. What do you think about such and such? And she'd scream at me, you're not hearing me. And three times. Well, tell me again. She'd tell me again her position. I said, well, what about that? You're not hearing me. So if I don't agree with her, it's because I'm not hearing her. That's ubiquitous among all of them. I've only heard two times. I've only heard somebody who is on the alphabet soup group rationally try to discuss things on a television panel. Two out of hundreds over the last 4 years. That was unique.
Well, that fits with the diversity, equity, and inclusion training for employees, doesn't it? Because that's an adult. I'm going to assert to you that that's an adult equivalent of the kindergarten struggle session we just talked about. One of your legal colleagues, Adrian Smith, gave a DIE training. DIE training. And I know you're aware of this, to the province's ombudsman's office. A participant produced a question, and I'll read it.
Okay, 100 staffers were forced to go to this training.
Yes, they didn't have the option of not going. And
right.
and do you want to take it from there and tell me what happened?
Well, a non-lawyer listened to all of this. This is all on the record. And there's question period. And he started off by, thank you very much. I've learned a lot from what you've said. I think it will be very helpful as I write opinions. But I have to tell you that some of the women I know have questions. Whereupon Adrian Smith, a male who claims to be non-binary, also claims to be the authority on this whole subject, interrupts him and says, "Are all of your friends racist too?" And just shook him. And basically went on to call him, further, he's a racist and these various things. And he just, very short discussion. And then that was the end of it. However, some days later, he gets called into the second highest person in the whole big ombudsman's office in Victoria and chastised, the only one of that whole group of 100, and chastised and told to go and take a course to learn how he had been inappropriate in what he said. Honest to God. Now he's given me permission to, and then of course he complained to the Law Society about it, about Smith, and the Law Society refused to deal with it. And they came back and said that the second time that Smith was not speaking as a lawyer. You know, that's the biggest crock of bull you've ever heard. Because there are examples of lawyers who, so anyway, they just threw it out. I'm not quite sure how I can use that in my situation, but it's an example together with the benchers who defamed Shadon Farside with such vulgarity, and they weren't even, just nothing, absolutely nothing.
So basically what happened here then is a workshop participant attempted to ask a question, prefaced the question in a way that showed that he was listening and taking something from the workshop, and then talked about the viewpoint of some of the women that he talked to about the erasure of women in things like sports and safe places. But before he could get the question out, the participant accused him of being a racist and asked if his friends were also racists. And then that was not the end of it. He was then disciplined in order to take, what was it, 16 hours of training, sensitivity training. It sounds like you're not permitted to ask questions.
It boggles any intelligent mind. And
well,
the thing of it is, the general public is only gradually becoming aware of this. I have a lot of friends, and I sort of have an age limit. I got a lot of friends. I'm old, and some of my friends are old, and some of my family are getting on. And if they're not interested in this subject, it doesn't bear in their lives, I leave it alone. Because it's like, you know, I've got grandchildren. I don't really try to make them realize how dangerous the world is and global warming and the nuclear bomb. You don't want to scare them unnecessarily. But if you're, 20, 30, 40, and you've got a life to live and you're going to have children, my granddaughters were raised and went through a Catholic school, which I, as an atheist, was not particularly fond of in the beginning, but it's not my say. However, there's no woke in that school, thank God. They've gotten through it.
You could do that.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got this die thing is going on across the country and across the United States and Europe too, frankly. July 6th, the National Post carried a story that I want to relate to you, and you may be already be familiar with it. It carried the story about a Toronto principal who challenged a die trainer's assertion that Canada is more racist than the United States. He was called an apologist. You're familiar with it?
Vaguely.
Okay, he was called an apologist for the United States and a white supremacist, and that was in front of his colleagues with the Toronto Public School Board.
He was called that by whom?
He was called that by the die trainer.
Okay.
Trainers, plural, two of them.
Yep.
Worse than, like the example in BC we just talked about, he was disciplined by his employer, and he had retired as a principal, but was still getting contract work as a principal, and he was denied further contracts. He started a suit against the Toronto Public School Board, but he died last week.
Oh, geez.
His lawyer wrote in the obituary with the approval of the family that the stress and effects of these incidents continued to plague Richard. Last week, he succumbed to this distress. This is very stressful when your colleagues think of you and won't talk to you, and your employer is disciplining you for basically being a decent person. The die firm, and I'll name the firm, it's Kojo Institute. They've previously given these workshops to the RCMP, the CBC, and the federal government. And this sounds like a pattern of indoctrination, and you will be punished if you question anything you are told. And here's my legal question to you, Carey, can the courts protect us?
Well, it's interesting because I've given this some thought. As I was portrayed in a newspaper article as a gadfly against the courts and the bullying of the Chief Justice, I do think the conservative part of the law, the best of the law, should be helpful, should be. And in some cases, it still is, but not here. Because, as an example, after CD's decision in February of 2019, a judge called Marzai, female, became, at the direction of the Chief Justice, the handler of the ongoing applications, and because there was a lot of stuff coming. Shut this down, shut that down, permit this, don't permit that. And she had been on the bench for less than a year. She came directly from being the president of a radical feminist legal organization called LEAF, West Coast LEAF, which gets federal funding and public, I think federal. Now they're going to get me if I'm not. It gets funded, and it actually has staff lawyers, and they take on a variety of cases. And they're extremely pro the alphabet soup group. Well, that's all they do. And so she had worked as a summer student there, and she'd been on the board 10 years and president for a couple of years, and she goes directly from that to the Supreme Court bench. And Hinkson, who wants to be, the favorite of this progressive stuff somehow, God knows why, puts her on this case. And when my client and I, CD, discovered this after the first couple of appearances, we brought an application that she recuse herself. And the lawyer for the child, Barbara Finley, who is as devout and ideological as any lawyer you want to meet for the alphabet soup group, used to work on a case with this judge. And it's quite obvious that the judge, the audience has to understand that an allegation of bias in a court, it's very hard to prove a judge is biased. So the rule isn't that you have to prove that he's biased, actually biased. What's the question is, would a person on the street, normal person, a citizen, who was familiar with the facts and the judge, could that person have a reasonable apprehension that there might be bias? Absolutely. Now but she didn't agree. Then an even more outrageous case comes with Hinkson. We apply to stay or stop the injection of the hormones, testosterone, to my client's minor, pending the appeal. And in 1 week, I asked the court registry to get us a judge. That afternoon, the clerk comes back and says, the Chief Justice will see you for an hour any day next week. So we picked Thursday with the other lawyers, of whom there was a whole slew, for Thursday. Okay. Thursday morning, we walk into court. Chief Justice says, I got all day. So we go all day. We argue some things, and I argue the recusal. Or maybe Herb Dunton was the lawyer who first started. I joined him as co-counsel. He's a very brave man to start this, as was our client. So then at the end of the day, he says, okay, I'll consider this. It's Thursday afternoon. Come back Monday morning. You'll have my decision. All right. Friday goes by. I go home on Friday afternoon, and there's an email from the Law Society, which says attached is a complaint against you. Oh, that's not a common thing, but I've had a lot of them over the years. So I look at it, and you will not believe it. The complaint is dated the Monday of that week, the 12th, 2 days before we're in front of the Chief Justice on the Thursday, and the complaint is from the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice on Monday complains to the Law Society against me, sits down on Thursday, never says a damn word, which he clearly should have. Anybody would. A first-year law student would know that that's actual bias. I don't have to stand up and say, I think because of your past associations, you might be biased. Here's the letter. So over the weekend, I get my tackle in order, and Monday morning I walk in and I say, before you say a word, I want you to recuse yourself. Nope. I argue the whole thing, and he makes the most absurd, absolutely illegal statement that I'm perfectly capable of keeping my feelings towards you separate from your client, because I had told him he had a legal obligation to explain what he's done, because my client deserved to know that he wanted a new judge or a new lawyer. He shouldn't have to sit there not knowing the judge had this animus towards me, but he turned it down. Now, that's the extent to which this woke phenomena has infiltrated the courts. And so it's very depressing for anybody who thinks that there's any sense of sanity in judges. Now, that's just 2 judges out of 100 in British Columbia.
So the identitarian woke make up their own rules.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, they don't make up their own rules. They just determine they don't have to follow any other rules.
Okay. What has happened? Now, I think this is related, but hey, I'm a layperson. I'm not a lawyer. What has happened in the case of Chilliwack school trustee Barry Neufeld? Last I heard, his case was appealed to the Supreme Court. What happened?
Oh, you haven't heard. another disaster. So briefly speaking, Neufeld is on the school board in Chilliwack. He has people coming up to him, parents, saying, what's this soji in the school? So he inquires at the school board level publicly about soji. Never says a word for or against transgender people, just says maybe we shouldn't be talking about this in the school, period. And the president of the BC Teachers Association, a gay man, and that's significant as it turns out, you wouldn't think it would be, goes after him and calls him transphobic, hateful, and basically defames him. So Barry Neufeld sues the president of the Teachers Association, and the lawyer for the president brings what we call a SLAP application, which was one of the great things the NDP brought into British Columbia, which can be used by people who get sued just to shut up by corporations. If they're, somebody comes along and sues a big company for pollution, they can be, a SLAP action can throw it out. And what the SLAP action does, it stops everything. And you go before a single judge in the Supreme Court, and you have to establish that somebody's right to not be defamed and right to their own privacy outweighs or doesn't outweigh another person's right to freedom of speech. So in this case, the judge said that at the hearing that the president of the school board's right to call Neufeld a bigot was more important than Neufeld's right not to be defamed. His lawyer, Paul Jaffe, one of the key lawyers in this country on these subjects from North Vancouver, he appealed that decision to the British Columbia Court of Appeal. The British Columbia Court of Appeal threw it out, reversed it, said no. So all of a sudden, Neufeld's litigation is back on track. Okay, the SLAP application failed. Then the president goes to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada permits 10 or a dozen interveners to come in on behalf of, and there's governments and attorney generals, none for Neufeld. And they hear it out and they reverse the Court of Appeal with the most saddening, devastating comment possible. They said that in looking at the SLAP idea, not only must you look at the president's rights to freedom of speech, you have to look at him as a member of an oppressed identity group. Can you believe that? Our Supreme Court of Canada has established that law. So defamation actions involving these things are out. SLAP is going to be no longer available for where it should be. People like Barry Neufeld are going to have to sit back and just take it. It makes you wish that we could go to the House of Lords in London. They would slap it. They wouldn't stand for it.
So let's see if I can summarize this. SLAP actions were a law brought in by the NDP to protect individuals from corporations, basically, that had a lot of money to go after people. Yeah. And instead, that is now being used to protect the right of the woke identitarians, a new right to slander people, to call them names.
Exactly.
Is that a good summary?
That is it.
That is it. Okay.
That
leads to my next question, which has to do with, have you read David Samuel's paper entitled "How Turbo Wokism Broke America? Oligarchs and activists are playing for the same team"? Have you read that?
No, send it to me, please.
Okay, I'll send that to you, but I'll summarize it first. His thesis is that we have just witnessed the greatest transfer of wealth from the middle class to multinational corporations in the United States. When the this newly impoverished middle class complains, the woke identitarian politicians call them white supremacists. As a socialist, what do you think of this thesis?
Well, I'm aware that it's a growing and complicated issue of to what extent. Look at Bud Light and this guy who I think is mentally ill, who is pretending to be a girl and fancy this, and she's just acting in the most outrageous. You know, excuse me a while. I live next to a hospital. There goes the sirens. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
There is this guy who's running in the Republican Party, the South Asian Indian fella whose name I can never remember. I've got his book here. He wrote a book called Woke Capitalism, and he's bang on. I can't see it there. Where is it? And he shows how capitalist corporations are incorporating a lot of this to sell products. And of course, it backfired with Bud Light. And of course, you have DeSantis working against Disney down in Florida. So this whole thing about to what extent corporations, I don't know if you can, what's the precise question that this issue, what was the question you asked me in specifics?
Okay, the thesis is that in turbo capitalism is that the identitarian woke group and the multinationals are working together, and that the multinationals are offering these struggle sessions which appease the woke, but they've also emasculated, taking a huge transfer of wealth from the middle class into the multinationals. So the multinationals are richer than ever. And when the middle class complain, the woke come forward and defame them. They call them white supremacists and racists.
Well, the transfer of capital from down to up has always been the case. And to what extent it's been increased by the woke, but I do know that there are more and more organizations that refuse to hire unless you can check off certain boxes of what you've done. And as an example, look at what I understand the Academy Awards have now put forward to say that they will not consider any film for Best Picture unless it has this, and this. And some artists are raising that. So, the more we think about this, the more depressing it gets, because it's everywhere, and it's every single day it's popping up. It's like the mycelia of wokeism is everywhere, but the mushrooms are just starting to pop all over the place. And to me, it's amazing that people who are intelligent look at some of these and don't see it for what it is. I have on my signature on my emails. I want to get this right. I think I remember.
It's as I recall, it's my correct pronouns correspond to my XY chromosomes. Is that what you're referring to?
That's one, and then I quote R. Lang, who says, just a minute. Oh, it's not on here. What does he say? We see that they're playing the game they're playing, but we can't let them know that we see the game.
Okay, yes, because you get in trouble if you let them know that you know.
You know the game.
But they know you know, but you can't say anything.
Well,
yeah. Okay, that signature though, the one that says my correct pronouns correspond to my XY chromosomes, that got you in trouble with the socialists in the United States.
Summer.
You registered for their 2020 conference in Chicago, and after you bought your ticket and booked your hotel, someone named Sean Larson, who's a member of the organizing committee, emailed to say that you were not welcome. He did not like your signature.
Yeah, I mean, the first person in the Democratic Party who came out a couple of years ago to warn the Democrats of wokeism was that respondent who ran Bill Clinton's campaign from Louisiana, who was married to what's that guy's name? A jovial character who's always on there. I have a bad memory of names. And then there's some discussion. What's happening with the left? The Democrats are going to lose so many supporters with this nonsense that a woman can be a man and vice versa. It was as simple as that. And these other issues, Black Lives Matters, which turned out to be a ripoff made some black people multimillionaires. And so the left has to figure this out. So I noticed that there's going to be a international meeting of the socialists, whatever. And one of the things they want to look at is how do we do better in the future? And I wanted to go and just listen to see if anybody raised this issue as a fundamental issue that the left's going to have to deal with. And I guess I sent them my initial emails without that signature because I got too many sites. And then I don't know why I sent them something that had my signature, and they immediately come back and say, "You're transphobic. We don't like what you're not welcome." And then I contemplated going anyways, and I had my room and having a press conference. But maybe I'm just a cynic in my old age. Not much is going to help. The courts aren't going to help. I can't advocate the classic Russian and Japanese old forms of assassination to correct political problems. But it's on a roll. But there are more and more people are starting to stand up. Not all of them for the right reasons, but then even if it's for the wrong reason, even if the middle class conservative white people in the United States come out and stop the butchering of girls, 14 and 15-year-old girls, and castrating boys, hey, that's an advantage, whether they're doing it for the right or wrong reasons.
So
it reminds me of years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, looking at trying to make the courts support fathers more. There was a right-wing conservative religious groups in Alberta, women who wanted to say that men need to be the head of the family again.
Was this real women? Was this real women, that organization?
Yeah. And yeah. Ann Cools, who was the single member of the Senate, the most progressive person in Ottawa ever on supporting fathers, she once said, well, they're an ally. And so there was a group who, for all the wrong reasons, wanted dads back in the family. And so that was great. I mean, I'm in favor of that. So they're a friend. And I found myself, it was very odd supporting them. I've often said that my mother, who was an avid Democrat, would roll over in her grave if she knew some of the people I was talking to particularly back in the CD case, when a lot of fundamental Christian groups in America and Canada were out there really pushing against the trans stuff.
So is the primary thing then, the primary strategy is to form alliances with all who oppose woke identitarianism? Is that the primary issue of our times?
I think so. And there's two things I want to say. One is, one thing which might help is someday somebody with a lot of money has got to bring in the courts a class action against the doctors. It's the medical profession who permits these doctors to maim these children. And it's the psychologists' profession who does this. There's an interesting case about to start in California. The most important legal case that's ever come down is the Carey Linde case out of London in England, where this girl who was convinced by the Tavistock English Health Plan people to transition to boy and take the hormones, detransitioned, went to court and sued the doctors and British Health and Tavistock for assuming she had the convincing her that she had the cognitive wherewithal to appreciate what she was agreeing to. That case came down and really had an effect on it. It shut things down. Now, it's subsequently been opened up a bit by the Court of Appeal, but there's a young woman in California, who exactly the same thing has happened. And she's gone into court, started an action in California Supreme Court against doctors and organizations, which convinced her to to transition with puberty blockers and testosterone, which was a disaster for her physiologically and mentally. So that'll work its way up the system. And then hopefully Canada will follow. So far in Canada, only these two cases that I've been involved with are the only ones in the whole country. It's really weird. We are so far out of it and behind it.
Okay, well, thank you for doing this interview, Carey. We've had I think a fascinating conversation that came back to where we started on that issue. And I take it you remain hopeful that we can win this one.
Oh, you got that impression?
I got that impression.
Well,
You're a fighter.
I'm glad to hear that that's the aura which comes off of my thinking. But I'm an optimist in my heart and an absolute cynic in my brain.
Okay.
I don't have those hopes. I'm sorry to say.
Okay, maybe I'm projecting. I will accept that. Okay. Take care, my friend.
Okay. See you then.
Okay. The New Enlightenment Project is committed to increasing civil discussion of difficult and controversial topics, such as the one we've just had with Vancouver lawyer Carey Linde. We offer a series of podcasts to further that aim. You can visit our website at nep-humanism.ca, where you can browse our blog, watch more interviews in this series, become a member, or make a donation. We are also on Facebook. You can subscribe to our podcasts and webinars at YouTube at nep-humanism. Thank you for watching and have a great day.